Full Stack Basics presents Master JavaScript. Unlock the power behind the frameworks.
Welcome to truth number 8. Asynchronous loading isn't a framework feature. It's a JavaScript superpower that's been there since day one. And in this episode, we're going to prove this to you because we're going to enhance our budget tracker to simulate asynchronous data fetching, teaching how to manage loading states and lifecycle events manually in vanilla JavaScript, which is going to set the stage for further understanding of React's use effect hook and lifecycle methods.
Full Stack Basics, Foundations. Learn tech in microsteps. Create a full stack Kanban board prototype with vanilla.js and the gem stack, including registration, login, and drag and drop functionality without libraries. Learn more at fullstackbasics.io/projects.
Go ahead and open your budget tracker with vanilla JavaScript first. Then the app for episode 7, this one, we are going to simply make a copy, which we're going to rename to episode 8. The reason for this is just so that you have all the versions of this. We don't need to do this in React because the changes in React are far less. So once we have the app for episode 8, we're going to come here to index.html and simply point our index to that file instead. Please pause, make sure you're here. Now that this is done, while we are in index.html, we are going to include a simple div with the ID of loading because we are simulating the loading message whenever something takes a little more time, hence mimicking the asynchronous call to a server. So go ahead and include this div, please. And then meet me over for a short trip to style.css. We're going to go all the way to the bottom and we're just going to include the styling for loading. Please pause and implement. Perfect. So now let's go ahead and work here on episode 8. So the first thing that I'm going to do is simply initialize the transactions as an empty array. Please pause and implement this. Then to actually mimic the fetching of transactions, we're going to create a function called fetch transactions. And if you want to see this with a backend, I really suggest that you join our course bundle.
This premium content is brought to you by Full Stack Basics JavaScript Bundle. Create a full stack Kanban board prototype with vanilla.js and the gem stack, including registration, login, and drag and drop functionality without libraries. Next, create a production-ready Kanban board with the Mern stack, including Google single sign-on and drag and drop. Learn more at fullstackbasics.io/projects.
It's going to be a lot of fun, so just throwing that in there if you want to learn more. Now in here, what we're going to do is simply return a new promise. So go ahead and include this, and let me fix the return statement, save, implement that code snippet. What we're going to do is resolve the promise, right? So include the keyword resolve here, then include the arrow, and then include a set of curly braces and make some room. Once again, we're still inside of the fetch transactions function. Pause and implement. What we're going to do here is that we are going to mimic that when this function runs, it gets some data from the server. And what we're going to do to mimic this is that we're going to set a timeout of about 1.5 seconds just to see in action what happens whenever you have a little bit of lag when your site is actually calling a server in another region or a region that is not as close as where you are opening the site from. So we're going to use the set timeout here. We're going to include a set of brackets, and inside of this set of brackets, I'm going to include another set of brackets so that we can set up an anonymous function here and make some room. Pause and implement. Now, what we're getting in a timeout once again, the timeout is simply to mimic this behavior, is data. So I'm going to create a constant variable called data, which is going to be an array. Pause and implement. And this array is simply going to have 3 objects where we have the description of some expenses, which is coffee. I am putting your salary at $1 million a year. Actually, you know what? Now that you have taken all these episodes, I think I want to bump you up to 3 million. And then groceries, well, they're not $50 anymore. Let's put them to 500 just because you get top-notch stuff at home, okay? So pause and implement this. I'm going to save just to reformat. And then let's make sure that we find ourselves in this a little unusual syntax. Right now, this is the array where we have the sample data. I'm going to make some room right under the array, and we're going to resolve this promise by bringing up the data. Pause and implement. Then I'm going to find this curly brace right here. And right out of here, I'm going to put a comma because here I can set up the timeout. And I'm going to set the timeout for 1500. This is basically a second and a half. Pause and implement. So now that we have our fetch transactions, I am simply going to minimize it. We need no changes to save to storage. We need no changes to set transactions. Now, under Update UI, we're going to implement a function called show loading. And basically here is how we're going to control when we show that div that reads loading. So all we have to do here is very simple. We are going to get 3 elements by ID. The loading div that we created, the transactions, and the balance. And all we're saying here is, when this function is called, block or show the loading div, which is this one right here that we just implemented with ID of loading. Then I want you to not display the transactions and I want you to not display the balance. Please pause and implement. Now, when the asynchronous request is done, we want to also stop showing the loading, right? So then what we want to do is hide the loading and show everything as needed. So for this, we are going to then simply display none of the loading and then go back to displaying the transactions and the balance. Pause and implement. Perfect. So I'm going to minimize here. I am going to scroll down. Our event listener stays exactly the same, but we are going to remove this call to update UI. Why? Because now we need to handle the asynchronous call that we are mimicking. So for this, I want you to create an asynchronous function called init. Go ahead and do this. Now, in the asynchronous function init, first thing we want to do is call the show loading function, because then the next thing that we want to do is actually get the data, which is an asynchronous call that we are forcing to take a second and a half. Then we are going to load the data to the transactions, which is that empty array that we had at the top. Then that's when we call the update UI function, and that's when we call the hide loading. And this is perfect because this allows for us to have sufficient time to have everything in place. So please pause and implement this. The last step is to add an event listener to the document that actually listens for the DOM content loaded, which is when we open the index.html, and it calls this init function. Pause and implement here. Perfect. So what's going to happen now is that when we test, it's going to simply try to load the transaction. It's going to perform this asynchronous call here, and it's going to give us a second and a half, in which case we should actually see this div here. So I'm going to open the browser. So now in the browser, when we are loading the page, you can see the loading here. And then a second and a half later, it shows the transactions that are the dummy data that we included in the asynchronous function. Other than that, the rest of the functionality seems to be working fine. So let me here include your book royalties. And then let's include a week that you're going to spend in the Alps recharging from all this success. So let's say that run you about $150,000. Once again, I don't know anything about these things, but I tell you one thing, I'm sure you can get a good vacation in the Alps with this kind of money. Perfect. Everything seems to be working great. Now open your React version of the budget tracker. Once again, if you are just joining us, you might want to go back to episode 6 and follow along from there. So what we're going to do now is that here in source, we're going to create a new folder that I'm going to call services. Go ahead and do the same. In here, create a new file called fetchtransactions.jsx. Go ahead and do the same here. Now here, we are going to use the same function, fetch transactions, that we implemented in vanilla JavaScript. The only difference is that this time we're going to export it so that we can call it from app.jsx. Pause and implement. Now we can head back to app.jsx, and all we have to do really is import that fetch transactions function here. Pause and implement. Now we are also going to change the transaction state variable to an empty array. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply comment out what we did for episode 7, and I'm going to just include a more simplified version of the transaction state variable initialized to an empty array. Pause and implement. Since we're going to be loading, we also want a new state variable for the loading effect. So basically, I'm going to set loading to true. That way, whenever we render the application for the first time, it's always loading. And when the data is actually fetched, that's when it's set to false. Pause and implement. Next thing we're going to do is implement a new use effect. And I'm going to implement it right above the one that we created a few episodes back. So this use effect is going to be a bit different, because what we're going to do here, and please follow along while I create the structure here of this use effect, is that this one is going to fetch the transactions and then is going to set the data in the transaction state variable, and then is going to set the loading to false. So for now, please pause and implement the bare bones. And then what we're going to do inside of this use effect is call the fetch transactions function. And then when we have the data, we are going to then call another function here. So include the arrow and curly braces. And what this function is going to do is very simple. It's going to set our transaction state variable with the data coming from the fetch transactions function, and then we're setting loading to false. I'm going to save to reformat. Next thing I'm going to do in this use effect is that on this closing curly brace, I'm going to include a comma, and then I'm going to include a set of brackets. Please pause and implement this. Next, I'm going to update the use effect that we already have. First, I'm going to wrap this line of code that we had in the previous episode inside of a conditional statement, meaning that when loading is set to false, that's when we set the transactions to local storage. And of course, here we have the transactions and the loading as dependencies. Pause and implement. The last stop here is that right above the return statement, we're going to add a conditional that for however long loading is true, then we're going to return the div of loading. Now, this time it's going to be a little different because the whole screen is going to read loading rather than just a portion like we did in vanilla.js. I just wanted to change that up for you a little bit in this episode. Pause and implement this. Perfect. So now we can go ahead and run our server. You already know how to do this, and meet me over at the browser. Over at the browser, when we're loading, all you see is a black screen with a loading message, and then we get the data that we are supposedly fetching. Now let's test the other functionalities. So if I add here the book royalties for the JavaScript book that you wrote, I'm gonna put here a good chunk of change for you there. Everything seems to be working great. Let's include an expense, which is going to be a private ski cabin in the Alps. I don't know how much that is, but I would love to go sometime. And I'm gonna add the transaction and everything is going. But now, since we are actually mimicking that we fetch data, when we refresh, it just goes back to the data that we fetched, and then it calculates the balance based on transactions that we add or subtract. Perfect. With this done, what have we learned? Well, we have reinforced the purpose of useEffect and how it handles things that happen outside of the normal flow. And also, we have seen the difference between initializing data and side effect reactions. But most importantly, we showed state and life cycle in both vanilla JavaScript and React. See you in the next episode.